Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, welcome back to the podcast. Today I bring you a solo episode about my first mini cut, which by the time this episode comes out, I ended about a week and a half ago, whereas at the moment of the recording, I've only been out of a deficit for about 5 days, and I have plenty of notes and the experience is very fresh on my mind. I have two aims with this episode. Number one, I want to give you my personal account of the experience. And number two is I want to explain how I set it up, what happened during it, and any tweaks that I might have had to make so that you can take some practical applications away for your own current and future fat loss phases. I want to make a little disclaimer before I go into the episode proper. I am going to discuss numbers such as steps and caloric intake. These are very specific to me. My body composition, my stature, my body weight, everything is all about me. And I am telling you about them because I want to give you my full experience, but I don't want you to use them for yourself because, well, you're not 5 foot and you're not me. You don't carry my amount of muscle mass or my amount of fat mass. You don't have my metabolism and so on and so forth. But also, if you know that specific mentions of numbers can potentially trigger disordered eating thoughts or feelings for you, you may want to skip this episode and keep yourself safe. Finally, before recording this episode, I asked for questions to my newsletter subscribers, shout out to you, and to my Instagram followers, and shout out to you as well, my friends. And I got some really interesting questions, so I will be answering those throughout as well. First off, I am going to start with an explanation of what a mini cut is. And I do have an interview on this very podcast where I go in quite a bit of depth about that with bodybuilding coach Steve Hull. And that was episode 42. So if you're interested, click on the link to that episode in the show notes. The TLDR, or too long didn't read, or really TLDL, too long didn't listen, is that a mini cut is a short, aggressive fat loss phase where you're aiming to spend between 4 and 6 weeks in a deficit, and you're typically aiming to lose around 1 to maybe 1.5% of your body weight per week, depending on the person. And it's usually utilized between muscle building phases. So you've been in a surplus for a certain period of time and you've accumulated a certain amount of body fat. Then you go through a mini cut to reduce that body fat, and then you continue with your muscle building phase, either in a surplus or at maintenance calories at the very least. The way I set up my own mini cut was the following. First, I was aiming to lose around 1% of my body weight per week. So if the range that I suggest is 1 to 1.5%, I chose the very bottom because I'm not a big person, I'm 5 foot tall, and I wasn't carrying so much body fat that I felt that going at a faster rate would be beneficial, because if you go too fast, if your deficit is too aggressive, you could risk muscle loss. Potentially, because it's such a short-lived deficit, the risk is low, but I've worked hard for the muscle I've built, And if I can do anything to keep it all, then I definitely will. So I was aiming for about 1% of my body weight per week, which is about 1 pound, which is easy math because the rule of thumb that I typically rely on is that 1 pound equals around 3,500 calories below my weekly maintenance, which means that I was aiming for a deficit of 500 calories below my daily maintenance. And the week before the mini cut, I went back to maintenance because prior to that, I had been in a surplus for several months. So that I calculated my maintenance from that surplus based on the rate of gain that I had achieved in the last 4 weeks. And I put that maintenance to the test by spending about a week on those calories. And it turned out that my maintenance at the time seemed to be around 1,950 calories. So I decided to set my original mini cut calories at around 1,450. I then decided to spend 6 weeks in a deficit, then deload and return to maintenance. And before deloading, I intended on continuing with the same training program that I had been following up until that point. Now, in previous fat loss phases, I've also found that sometimes my metabolism tends to adapt pretty quickly at the beginning of a fat loss phase. And what I mean by that is that I find that the deficit I originally planned at the beginning of a fat loss phase doesn't seem to yield the results that I expected, in that I tend to lose at a slower rate than originally planned. Now, if this had been a longer fat loss phase, it wouldn't really have bothered me. However, because I only intended to spend such a short time in the deficit, I wanted to edge my bets towards losing at the rate I had in mind. So I also decided to increase my steps by about 2,000 per day to ensure that I would create the calorie deficit that I had in mind. And soon enough, or at least later in the episode, you'll find out if I accomplished that goal or not. Now, the first question that I got, and thank you very much, question asker. This was an anonymous question, so I don't know what your name is. The question was, why did you feel the need to cut? As I was saying, prior to starting the mini cut, I had been in a muscle building phase in a surplus for several months. And the original plan was to continue with that for at least a little bit longer. However, in mid-January, I had my first consultation for top surgery. And during this consultation, I was informed that the actual procedure is likely going to take place between October 2024 at the earliest and January 2025 at the latest. I later found out that it might even be earlier, but I don't know any more than that at this moment in time. Of course, that's amazing news. But when I received this information, I was also already very close to the top of the body fat range that I'm comfortable reaching when I choose to gain weight. So I was already thinking that within a few weeks at best, I would consider a fat loss phase. Now, I could have opted for continuing to build muscle, as I've been saying, whether in a surplus, or maybe I could have gone back to maintenance calories, and then I could have completed a longer, more moderate fat loss phase later this year and closer to surgery in order to achieve the body composition that I want to be at for the procedure, closer to it. But in the end, I decided against this. And I'm going to take a little bit of a detour to explain why I made this decision, because something I want to share is that in that time period, in January, I was also wondering if I still was interested in bodybuilding. I have been passionate about it since 2018 when I learned more about it and I got into it. But lately, I had been feeling like I wasn't really sure that I wanted to be in a deficit, and I was also wondering whether I wanted to be in a surplus in the future or whether I simply wanted to continue to train and stay around maintenance. At the same time, I hadn't been in a fat loss phase since 2022 because of the gut health issues that I suffered from between the end of 2022 and the end of 2023. So it was also possible that my view of bodybuilding had been soured by spending such a long time in the throes of those gut health issues, where I hadn't really been able to pursue bodybuilding the way I would have wanted to because I had been forced to prioritize my gut health. So I thought that the mini cuts would give me some perspective because it would give me the opportunity to re experience fat loss after over a year of never engaging in such a diet. And I'd already been in a surplus for a few months, so I already had that kind of perspective. And I thought if I can have both experiences, this is going to give me the insight that I need to figure myself out. And the mini cut did exactly that. So I am really grateful to my past self from January for deciding to go through with it. As I was progressing through the diet, I realized that I still very much love bodybuilding. The process of losing fat and gaining muscle over time is so fascinating, rewarding, and empowering for me. But why was it that I was uncertain about it then? And I considered what I had been doing up until now. My experience, for the most part, has been of really long muscle building phases, where my first serious and successful one was about a year and a half long, including both periods in a surplus and periods at maintenance. And I gained about 20-ish pounds, which is 20% of my body weight, which is a considerable amount of weight. And then I followed up these long muscle building phases with really long fat loss phases as well to lose 20-ish pounds, which is again 20% of my body weight. And even though I always lost it at a very, very moderate pace, I always took about 6 months to do so, it's still a lot of weight to lose. And spending 6 months in a deficit does take a toll on you psychologically. It's tiring. And also physiologically, your body is under stress when you spend a long time in a deficit. Not only that, but my body was also under more stress than would be typical in a deficit because I wasn't just trying to lose excess body fat, I was trying to get very lean for two photo shoots. One in 2021, where I achieved a very lean body composition that was close to unsustainable for me. I was on the brink. And then in the 2022 photo shoots, I outdid that shape and I got into the leanest, most conditioned shape of my life to date, which was incredible. I am so proud of myself for being able to go through that diet and that training program and for the pictures that I achieved as a result. However, that was definitely an unsustainable physique. In fact, I spoke to a bodybuilding coach that I know and I asked him, look, if you had to tell me, if you had to give me an idea, would you be able to say, based on these pictures of me right now, how close to being able to step on a bodybuilding stage I am? And he said to me, based on the picture, I would say you've got 2 to 4 pounds to lose. 2 to 4 pounds means I was extremely close to being peeled or shredded or however you want to call it, which is absolutely unsustainable. And for me, that shape was already unsustainable. So in short, this was too much for my body and my mind. So the reason why I felt like I didn't want to go through these cycles of deficits and surpluses anymore in mid-January wasn't that I'd lost interest in bodybuilding as a whole, but more so that I had lost interest in shifting so much weight, both upwards and downwards. So what I want to do instead, going forward, is to still build muscle and lose fat over time, but I want to move within a smaller body weight range. I no longer want to lose or gain up to 20% of my body weight because I consider that to be a little bit too extreme, not only in terms of the toll it takes, but also because I'm no longer a beginner. When you're a newbie, you are going to make progress at a much faster rate. So if you gain a reasonable amount of body weight, you are going to put on quite a bit of muscle. So quite a bit of that weight is going to be muscle in percentage. But the more advanced you become, the smaller the percentage of muscle mass that you gain when you put yourself in a position where you're gaining weight. So based on the fact that this is my 6th year of training consistently, and I never taken more than a month off at a time, and that was because I got injured, then I don't think that shifting so much weight is going to lead to better results for me. I think that maintaining my weight, shifting my weight, changing my body weight within a much smaller range is going to make the process not only far more enjoyable and sustainable, but also it's going to likely give me better results. Because one, again, it's more appropriate to the pace at which I can realistically gain muscle at my stage in my training career. But number two, I'm also no longer spending half a year in a deficit, which is a really long time to spend in a phase where if you don't carry a lot of excess body fat, your muscle building potential is going to be compromised compared to if you were at maintenance or in a surplus. In addition to that, I also gained some really important insights. I think this minicut really provided kind of an epiphany for me at my stage in my bodybuilding journey. I realized that I'm no longer interested in getting exotically lean at this moment in time, meaning I'm not really interested in dieting to get super lean for another photo shoot. And I also realized that I have much less of a focus on getting lean in general or looking lean. And that used to always be my priority, looking lean over building muscle. And probably in part that comes from my eating disorder days. When I had an eating disorder, I overvalued being slim. And I say slim instead of lean because at the time I wasn't even lifting, so I had no muscle to speak of. Therefore, you can't really say I was lean. I just wanted to lose a lot of weight because originally I was overweight. And once I'd lost that weight, I was really keen to maintain that weight loss. So I believe that skewed my preferences towards prioritizing looking leaner once I got into bodybuilding. Now, these priorities seem to have shifted in that I want to prioritize gaining more muscle and prioritize also feeling good. I want to focus on my mental and physical health. And luckily, both of these can be accomplished in the same way. So I can kill two birds with one stone by focusing on spending as much time as possible in an anabolic environment or in a muscle building environment. So either in a surplus or at maintenance calories. And I want to try and minimize the time that I spend in a deficit throughout the year. So this brings me back to the question, why did you feel the need to cut? And I was saying that while I could have opted for the longer, more moderate fat loss phase closer to surgery, I chose not to. And the reason is that I simply didn't want to spend 6 months in a deficit. And if I had gained any more weight, I would have likely needed around that amount of time because I was getting close to the weight that I had achieved at the end of that very long muscle building phase that I spoke about, when I then ended up losing about 15 to 20 pounds over time to bring my body composition back to where I would have wanted it to be. So for these reasons, keeping the fat loss phase short and sweet appealed to me a lot more. Another reason, rather than personal, was professional, in that I had never completed a mini cut before. My main experience has been with longer, more moderate fat loss phases. But as a coach who coaches people to go through the physique development process, I am very keen to experience as many aspects of this process as I realistically can. And I say realistically because there are some aspects of fitness that I probably never will experience. For example, I've been overweight, but I've never lived with obesity. And because of the lifestyle I lead now, it's unlikely that I ever will live with obesity. So I can't experience that aspect of fitness or of life, but I can experience something like a mini cut instead. And doing so is going to enable me to better advise my clients on what to expect from a mini cut, what practical and psychological challenges they may want to look out for, and I can help them prepare for these challenges. So this seemed to be a great opportunity to bring these intentions together. Now, you could say, well, why specifically this time of year? You could have gone back to maintenance if you didn't want to continue gaining weight, and you could have done the mini cut closer to surgery. And while that's true, I don't think it would be appropriate to go through such an aggressive fat loss phase, especially since I'd never done it before, so I couldn't be sure of how it would go for me, but also so close to surgery, because as I explained, a mini cut is meant to be a bridge between two muscle building phases. But if I had done it right before surgery, after surgery, I'm going to have to stop training for 6 weeks. So I'm not really going into another muscle building phase. I'm going into a surgery recovery phase. And so that's the reason why I decided to do it earlier in the year. And now I've bought myself a few more months until at least October, where I can continue to be at maintenance or in a surplus and therefore continue building muscle by being consistent with my training. The next question I got was, did anything unexpected happen? And yes, of course, I am big on planning, but things always go a little bit pear-shaped, which is also why planning is so important, because it makes it easier to pivot. And while there were several small things that didn't quite go according to plan, I am going to focus on the two main curveballs that I encountered. One had to do with nutrition, and the other had to do with training. So I'm going to start with nutrition. As I've said, I originally set my target calories to be 1,450 every day, and I also slightly increased my steps just because I expected that my metabolism would adapt pretty quickly to the deficit and I could end up losing at a lower rate that I intended on. Now, what happened is that my body did adapt to the decrease in calories really quickly, and it adapted even more than I expected. And in week 1, even accounting for the fact that normally in the first week or so of fat loss, you can see a large change in scale weight because you're losing not only fat, but also a bunch of water from reducing your carbohydrate intake. Even accounting for that, my weight still didn't shift by even 1%. Now, this doesn't happen to everyone because we all have a different metabolism. And this metabolism can also change over time as your lifestyle and your health and your health status change. And my lifestyle and my health are certainly very different from what they were at the time of my last intentional fat loss phase in 2022. And in addition to that, I had prior experience of discovering that indeed my metabolism does seem to slow down in response to a deficit straight out of the gates. It seems that the longer I stay in a deficit, the smaller the variation becomes, but at the very beginning, there is quite a bit of adaptation. And some metabolisms adapt faster than others. And you may find that perhaps you struggle to lose weight even when you're technically in a deficit, or vice versa. For some people, your metabolism adapts in the opposite direction to where you go into a surplus in air quotes, or you expect it to be a surplus, and then the scale doesn't budge. So that as a result, you have to either decrease your calories if you're planning for a deficit, or increase your calories more than you expected. And sadly, in my case, what happened was that I had to decrease my calories if I wanted to increase the rate of loss. And an important point I want to make here is that that's the reason why any starting target you give to yourself needs to be considered just your beginning. And you need to appreciate that you need to keep an open mind and adjust the target as you collect more data on how your body responds. So in most cases, you can't expect to use a calculator to work out your deficit and keep that exact deficit as you go through the entirety of your fat loss phase. This is absolutely fine and normal. Anyway, once I hit this roadblock, I decided to drop my calories right away, even though if I had been dieting for longer, I would have waited at least 2 to 4 weeks before making a change. The reason is simply due to time. I was only going to spend max 6 weeks in this mini cut, so if I'd waited 2 to 4 weeks, that could have been the entirety of the cut. So what would have been the point, right? And that's why I made a little bit of a drop in calories. It wasn't a large drop, it was really just 60 calories in total. So I went from 1450 to 1390, and I didn't change my steps at all. I didn't increase my cardio, that stayed the same throughout. And so did my training program, at least for the purpose of the deficit. And that was enough to get the scale, and my body composition to start taking in the right direction for me. Now, the second curveball that I encountered was related to training. The original plan, as I was saying, was to continue running the exact same training phase that I had been on for at least 3 months up until then. And then I wanted to deload at the end of the minicut, not really in the middle of it. But this didn't quite pan out the way I expected to. 4 weeks into the cut, I was experiencing several signs that I needed to deload sooner. Some were psychological, where I was feeling more and more fatigued from sessions that I felt fine to do otherwise. I felt less motivated to go into the gym and smash those weights. And some were physical. And the primary physical issues I encountered were two persistent niggles. I had some pain in my left adductor when I got into hip flexion, which made the majority of compound lifts for the quads quite painful. And I had to change my exercise selection to the point where in week 4 of the minicut, I was avoiding temporarily all compound lifts for the quads, and I was only doing variations of leg extensions. And then the other niggle was in my right elbow. That was much less problematic, but it was still present. And I thought, what is the point of risking injury just to push for 2 more weeks in a deficit while handling these niggles as best as I can? So I thought, I'm going to take my diet break sooner. I'm going to deload during this diet break, and hopefully this will help my niggles sort themselves out. And it actually did accomplish that goal. And the reason why I took a diet break, so I increased my calories to estimated maintenance, is that I didn't want to be in an aggressive deficit during a deload. Because during a deload, the point is not to build more muscle, it's to reduce your fatigue. So at best, you're going to maintain the muscle you have. But this assumes that you're going to be around maintenance. And I was already in an aggressive deficit. I'm already not carrying much excess body fat, whereby that would protect me from muscle loss, because my body would sooner get rid of the excess body fat than of muscle. In my case, that's not what would happen. So being in a deficit while deloading seemed to be a risk that I didn't want to run. And that's why I combined this deload with a diet break at estimated maintenance. Moving on to the next question. This is really interesting, and it is, did your minicut trigger behaviors/thoughts of disordered eating? And it's interesting because given that it was my first ever experience with a minicut, I didn't actually know before I started whether it would cause me any such issues. However, before I answer the question directly, I want to make what I believe to be an important note. Since the question mentions behaviors and thoughts, I believe there is a difference between disordered behaviors and disordered thoughts, in that behaviors aren't necessarily disordered or the opposite of disordered. I don't think it's ordered. Let's say maladaptive or adaptive. In my view, behaviors are neutral. What matters most is your intention behind a certain behavior and the degree to which you take that behavior, as well as how flexible you are around that behavior. For example, when you're in a calorie deficit, I tend to opt for high volume meals so that I can have a bigger portion for a lower amount of calories, so that I eat more food and I'm more satiated. Now, when I had a full-blown eating disorder, I did the same thing. However, my portions were massive. I had humongous amounts of vegetables that always made me feel extremely bloated afterwards. And that was because I was eating so little that I needed to bulk up my meals with as many vegetables as I could possibly stomach to feel any sort of satisfaction, fleeting as it was. Whereas now, my vegetable portions are what I would consider more reasonable, mainly because they don't give me the same digestive discomfort. And I don't take volumizing my meals to the same extreme degree because the deficit isn't so extreme. I'm not actually starving myself as I was when I had an eating disorder. In addition to that, I have much more flexibility around my fat loss friendly behaviors, even when they look like disordered or behaviors that I would have engaged with when I had an eating disorder. The difference is that now I can pivot and make changes. Whereas when I had an eating disorder, if I couldn't follow exactly the plan I had in mind and eat the exact foods that I had in mind in the exact quantities at the exact time, I would literally break down into tears. Now, yeah, my preference is to have a high volume meal. But during the mini cut, I actually went to Edinburgh for a couple of days and I didn't have my kitchen as I usually do. I only had an Airbnb and we even had to eat out for a couple of meals. So my food choices were very limited and I couldn't just opt for voluminous meals all the time. Sometimes I had to opt for portability and accessibility and ease of preparation over volume simply because I didn't have access to the tools that I needed. But I really didn't make a big deal of it. I just went on with my life. So this is to say that while I might have engaged, or I might engage even to this date, with behaviors that I also engaged with when I had an eating disorder, whenever I go through a fat loss phase, it's not necessarily the behavior that's disordered, it's that the behavior is really useful during a fat loss phase. But my intention behind that behavior, the degree to which I take it, the extreme to which I take it, and also how flexible I am around that behavior are all very, very different. Now, going back to the question, did I believe that I had a relapse into disordered eating thoughts? No, I don't believe that happened. And now that I've tried both aggressive and shorter fat loss phases and less aggressive and longer ones, I'm pretty confident that neither of them is triggering for me. And I think it's because I'm just in a really different place in my life. For one, I'm no longer afraid of losing my results in the same way that I was when I developed the eating disorder. Not only that, but at the time I overvalued being small and weighing less, whereas I'm just not interested in that now anymore. When I developed an eating disorder, I was a teenager. I was around 14 or 15, and I had been overweight for many years. I grew up overweight. I was bullied for it. It was a source of low self esteem and trauma for me. I also didn't really understand how fat loss worked. So when I finally felt like I had achieved that appearance that I had chased for so long, I was absolutely terrified of regain all the weight that I had lost. And I could only rely on what I did know in order to maintain my results. And what I did know was that everything that I was doing, over exercising and under eating, had helped me reach that slim body. So why wouldn't it help me maintain it? That's how I thought at the time. And that's why perpetuating those behaviors seemed to be the only way to maintain that body composition. Now I have a much more in-depth understanding of the scientific process behind fat loss and muscle gain. So I'm no longer scared of going backwards at any point. I also know that there are far better methods to achieve my goals, and my goals are different. I no longer overtly value being extremely lean to a degree that's detrimental to my mental and physical health. So no aspect of the physique development process, whether that's gaining weight or losing body fat, seems to present a trigger for me anymore. I just view all of these components of the process as components, pieces of a puzzle that I'm very passionate about continuing to work on. Now, this was another anonymous question, and I want to say that if you asked out of concern for my well being, thank you. And if you asked because you're struggling with an eating disorder or with disordered eating, and you thought that maybe hearing about my story could give you some inspiration or some hope for your own recovery, reach out. I'm always really happy to talk. Now, my next question is, do you change your training program between fat loss and muscle growth? Now, as stated, I was actually planning on maintaining the exact same training phase throughout the minicut if I hadn't gotten those curveballs I talked about. So the answer is no. And the reason is that the principles of hypertrophy or muscle growth don't change based on your nutritional status. So it doesn't matter if you're in a deficit, at maintenance, or in a surplus. The way you build muscle is always the same because muscle growth is driven by training, not by nutrition. But saying that, I would typically make some adjustments like I did it during my minicut to my clients' programs as well, based on their recovery as they continue on with the minicut or longer fat loss phase. For instance, the longer you are in a deficit, the more fat you lose, and or the more aggressive the deficit is, even when the diet itself is shorter, the harder it can become to recover from a training program that felt fine when you were at maintenance or in a surplus. So while I typically keep training similar at the start of a fat loss phase, because I like to change one variable at a time. So if I'm changing nutrition from maintenance or a surplus to a deficit, I would like to keep training the same in the majority of cases. Over time, I'm prepared to continue assessing my clients' response and their ability to progress and recover. And if I see that they're starting to struggle, progression seems to falter, they're getting signs that they're not recovering as well, then I will typically make some tweaks to volume, intensity, or some other variables as needed. Maybe some clients need a couple fewer sets, or maybe we want to train a little bit further from failure than we normally would when we have calories aplenty at maintenance or in a surplus. But there is no such thing as a fat loss program as opposed to a muscle gain program per se. All and any changes that I choose to make to a training program between different nutritional phases are always based on your ability to recover and progress with the program. Next question, did you lose any strength? And I'm interpreting this question as, did you lose reps or did you have to reduce the weight that you were lifting? And the answer is that overall, not really. Certain lifts actually continued to improve at pretty much the same pace, which really surprised me because I was in an aggressive deficit. I was happy about it, don't get me wrong, but also impressed. Other lifts started to slow down, but they didn't stop improving. It's just that the rate slowed down, which I expected more. And finally, certain lifts, particularly overhead presses, like I'm doing an overhead barbell shoulder press at the moment, those stalled towards the end of the mini cut. And I find, and also when I talk about other coaches, I found that in their experience as well, pressing movements for your pecs and for your shoulders tend to slow down in progression or stall a little more quickly or in a little bit of a more pronounced manner than other lifts. So that was also not really unexpected on my part. And what I believe is important to reflect upon with regards to this question is that in an aggressive deficit like this, you can expect to accumulate a certain degree of diet fatigue, and diet fatigue can impact your training performance, but I wouldn't necessarily expect that it would happen to the point where your performance is downright deteriorating massively. If you're dropping reps, if you're dropping weight by a noticeable degree, I would argue that either your approach is too aggressive, so your deficit is far more aggressive than it needs to be, or your mindset isn't in the right place. Because when you know that in a fat loss phase you're going to incur diet fatigue at a certain point, you can actually turn yourself into a self-fulfilling prophecy and start telling yourself, oh, well, I'm in a deficit, so I'm going to be a little bit more tired. And you pull back on training without meaning to. So I made a point of stepping into the gym every time as if I was still at maintenance or in a surplus. I wanted to make progress just as much as I wanted when I was on higher calories. And I believe that that really helped me avoid any performance losses that could have come from my mindset rather than my physiology. The next question is a good one. What mistakes did you make? Now, the major mistake I made was that I could have prioritized my sleep a lot more. I am normally very, very protective of my bedtime routine, even more so when I'm in a deficit, because that's when your sleep can be disrupted by a deficit over time. It doesn't happen to everyone, it doesn't happen right away. But at some point, it could be a sign that you're accumulating diet fatigue. So that's why in a deficit, even more so than at other times, I'm very careful to respect my bedtime routine. But for various reasons, this time I let this go more often than I would have liked. So, all in all, I estimate that I had a cumulative amount of about maybe 7 to 10 days of suboptimal sleep. And over a 6 week mini cut, or 6 weeks in a deficit, because as I said, I also had a seventh week of a deload, 7 days of suboptimal sleep is about 17% of the whole time. So my average over time is still pretty solid. So I'm not saying, oh man, this completely ruined the experience. I wouldn't want to scare you into thinking that if you miss a couple of nights sleep, you're going to totally mess up your fat loss phase. That's not at all the case. But I did feel the effects of those suboptimal nights of disrupted sleep. And I also know that it was in my power to make better choices. And also, I'm highlighting this particular mistake because I have so much experience with fat loss at this point that I don't tend to struggle with overeating or making inappropriate food choices or missing out on my steps or cardio. What I can struggle with more is look after my stress and look after my sleep. And in this case, the sleep took a toll, unfortunately. But hopefully, I have learned from this experience because, as I said, I certainly felt the effects. And in the future, I will be more mindful. But only time will tell. The last question I am going to cover in this episode is, did you learn any unexpected lessons or discover something that surprised you? And yes, I actually discovered two interesting facts for myself. The first one is about the scale weight. Now, as of late, especially in the last few months, I've been implementing a really effective strategy to stop my clients from overtly focusing on the scale weight in a fat loss phase and therefore getting distracted from what matters the most, which is the daily actions that they take to achieve their nutrition and movement targets. Remember, the scale is not under your control, but your daily actions are. So you need to keep your eyes on the prize, and the prize is those actions, because the actions will lead to fat loss. The scale going up and down is not really under your control. What matters really is the trend over time, not the change on a daily basis or even on a weekly basis. We're talking about trends over several weeks at a time. One of these strategies that I've been implementing is I get my clients to get a Bluetooth scale, and then they download an app. And when they step on the scale, they have the app open and they don't need to look at the number on the scale because the app records it automatically. And then what they do is they hook up their account on this app to my own account. They don't even look at the weight at any point. All I do is I will have their account in my friends list, on my friends list, and I can check their weight and record it. So I use it to coach them and to make appropriate decisions about the deficit to be in, their cardio, their nutrition, and their steps. But they don't have to trouble themselves with the number on the scale. So I thought I would do something similar for myself out of curiosity to see how I would respond. And so what I've been doing since the beginning of the mini cut is I weigh myself daily, but instead of looking at the number, I step on the scale and I don't look at it and I let my app record the scale weight. Now, at this moment in time, I'm self coached. So I don't have somebody to look at the weights for me, the weigh-ins for me. So what I do is I wait until the very end of the week and then I look at all of the weigh-ins at once and I record them on my spreadsheet to work out the weekly weight average and calculate the average weekly weight loss rate. And because all of my clients love that they don't have to focus so much on the scale, I knew this strategy would be helpful, but I was really impressed by the profound positive effect that this had on me. Because when I was looking at my weight every single day, even though I now know to treat it as data, to an extent, it's still hard to do to yourself because we all have an emotional attachment to our own body and to an extent to the weight on the scale, especially if you grew up in an environment where diet culture messages were abundant. And I grew up as a person assigned female at birth, and all girls are subjected or were subjected to these messages as I was growing up in Italy. So I had and have an emotional attachment to the scale, even though it's much, much less pronounced than it has ever been. And by looking at the weight only once a week and also looking at it not just at one number, but at 7 different numbers, none of those really had any time to take root inside my head and make me think about the number and feel about it in any particular way. Whereas when I'm weighing myself every day and I look at the number every day, that number stays with me for the next 24 hours until I see the next one. And each number stays with me until the end of the week when I work out the weekly average. Whereas by seeing all these numbers at once, calculating the weekly average immediately, I simply didn't have enough time to process all of these numbers at once. So it was really easy to not think about them at all. And something else I did that was really useful was before looking at the numbers, I would look at my physique pictures because I was taking progress pictures every week, once a week. And I would compare those first to the week before and the first week of the mini cut. And only then would I look at the numbers. And as a result of that, I found myself being a lot more focused on the physical changes, which in the end are the most important, because when you want to lose fat, you don't want the number on the scale to change. You want your physical appearance to change. So I was prioritizing the data that was actually important. And then on a day-to-day basis, I was never really thinking about how much I weighed. I was just focused on getting on with the deficit, getting on with my steps, my cardio, and also my caloric intake. And in fact, I am so pleased now with this outcome that I intend on carrying on with this approach for the foreseeable future, even now that I'm no longer in a deficit. The second helpful lesson that I learned is that I quite enjoy having higher calorie days and lower calorie days, because in previous fat loss phases and also in general at maintenance or in a surplus, I don't really tend to have higher calorie days and lower calorie days. I would have a linear intake every single day, and then if I have a social event where I want to save some calories, then I might drop my calories by 100 for a few days and add those calories on top of the day of the social event. But that's as much as I have ever done in terms of calorie cycling. Whereas this time I thought, how about I have 5 low calorie days and then 2 high calorie days, and I find out how that makes me feel. And I actually found that this was very beneficial in that I could be motivated to stay on a low calorie intake for 3 to 4 days at a time if I knew that the higher calorie day was coming and that the higher calorie day was going to be in the order of 1700 calories, and that at the lowest, my lower calorie days were only 1300 calories. I never went below 1300 as a round number in my caloric intake. And I discovered that I quite enjoyed that. I was also very strategic with the placement of these high calorie days, in that, as I said, I didn't go more than 3 to 4 days at a time without one. And I also put them on my rest days. The reason being that on my rest days, when I don't train, I also spend more time thinking about food because I have less on my schedule to do. One of these days is a working day, so there's still a bit to do. Well, there's quite a bit to do since I'm working, but the other is my day off from training and also from work. And on that day, I can easily get into a frame of mind where I'm constantly thinking about food, or very frequently thinking about food if I'm also in a deficit, which makes me psychologically and physically hungrier than usual. And I found that by placing my rest days, my higher calorie days on those days, I wasn't really thinking about food. My food focus was very manageable. I wasn't struggling with hunger. And the day after the high calorie day, since I trained really early in the morning, right after meal one, I still had energy from the previous day left over, plus the extra meal one on the first low calorie day after a high calorie day, whereby my performance was potentiated. So I'm thinking that in the future, I might take this approach again when I go into another fat loss phase. And with that, that's a wrap on all the questions that I received. It's a wrap on my review of my mini cut. And my closing remark is that I consider this experience to have been pretty successful, not only because I ended up losing about 5.5% of my body weight, so nearly 1% per week over 6 weeks in a deficit, very close to the goal that I had set for myself, but also because it ran very smoothly, considering it was my first experience of something so short and aggressive. And now it's one more tool in my arsenal for my own physique development process, and I have a lot more confidence that I can coach other clients through it successfully. I have been reading about mini cuts and learning about them from other coaches as well for several years. And in addition to that, I don't necessarily believe that you have to have experience of everything you coach to help someone with it. For example, despite not having had obesity myself, I have helped and help a lot of clients currently who live with obesity. Having said that, when I do get the opportunity, I believe it is beneficial for me to complement empirical knowledge with practical knowledge from my own experience. I really hope that this was valuable to you and that it was an intriguing conversation to have with me. I really value that you chose to spend some time listening to me today. Thank you so much for that. If you want to work with me, I'm currently taking on online clients. So you can apply by clicking on the link in the description below. And if you want to connect with me, you're going to find links to my Instagram, my email address, and my website as well, again, in the show notes. So please don't be shy. I'm always very happy to talk. And with that, have a great rest of the day, and I'll talk to you next time. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.